So where do you go to find the best podcasts to be able to grow your business, connect with the right audience, and help more people with your message? My name is John Cook. I'm the founder of Keynote Content, and over the last 4 years, I've worked with over 800 speakers one-on-one, helping them craft their messages and then share those messages through podcasts, through speaking events, through different opportunities that they get to connect and share and make a difference in the world around us. And now, if you're wanting to be on more podcasts, you might say, I love this idea, but where do I even find the right podcast? How do I reach out to the host? How do I even start that conversation? Then how do I become the best guest ever as a podcast? So I put together a variety of different recordings, whether it's on YouTube or whether it's through podcasts that you can connect with and get the ideas and information on how to build your business through podcast appearances. But today, right now, we're going to focus on finding the right podcast. The first place I want you to look is podcast directories. Podcast directories, they're very much built for people who actually are the podcast hosts, but there is this match, there's a kind of a lock and key situation saying, okay, for podcast hosts coming saying, I want to look at this directory of potential podcast guests. Usually the lineups are pretty thin. It's not a lot of good options to choose from. But for you to come in and say, all right, I want to go on there, I want to build out a great profile. Here are a couple of places you can go. You can go to podcastguest.com. This is an amazing directory, podcastguest.com. They have a great setup there. You can fill out a profile, put together, and then you start to reach out to podcast hosts directly through podcast guests. Amazing. Another one I like is Matchmaker. It's matchmaker.fm. And they have some really good resources as well for you to kind of build out that guest profile and also highlight other places. Think of it like the IMDb. If you're familiar with like the International Movie Database.com, imdb.com, I believe that's what it's called, where it shows you, hey, what movies somebody's been in as an actor or director or producer. In the same type of vein with Matchmaker, you can also build out that same type of IMDb profile. Link in podcasts, guests we've been on, or if you have your own podcast, you can also put your link to your host as it there. So those are two options. A third one that I really like is Podchaser. Podchaser is one very similar type of situation. I will say what I like more about Matchmaker.fm and podcast guests is that it lets you really develop out your profile more. Podchaser is really getting there, but there's more of a it's just different styles, but those are 3 options for starting. That's a good place to start. A second place I really recommend is going to an Amazon bestseller list. And you say, why would I go to Amazon bestseller list? That's a book. Well, a lot of traditional publishing houses and even some more independent publishing houses are saying for somebody who's wanted to be an author that they also have a podcast. So it's an opportunity to get their message out through the written word, but also through the audible or auditory communication from a content standpoint. So you have the written from like a learning style, but you also have the audio or the audible from a learning style as well. So they're hitting 2 different learning styles. And if you have a podcast for an author, they're looking for guests. It's not just them talking about their topics all the time. So you go to Amazon bestseller list, find out, hey, what are the top 100, and then start at the bottom. Start at the bottom from 100 up to 91 and say, okay, find out and who are the hosts. Do they have podcast guests? And when you go to the bestseller list, it's going super specific inside your niche. Not just your industry, but the niche. Find out, okay, so you put in a long tail search word instead of just find like, hey, books on finance. Well, the bestseller finance list on Amazon has hundreds of thousands of different books. That's not really going to narrow it down by saying, okay, financing for single parents, or financing for young families, or financing books for whatever it might be. Find out where your niche is and saying, okay, I want to go and find the top 100 books in that niche bestseller list on Amazon, and then look at the bottom 10 from 100 to 91 and start researching. Do Google searches, find their websites, and I say take those terms and go into the Apple podcast store, and like your app store, go into your Apple podcast app and search that name of the bottom 10 of the bestsellers, like 100 to 91, inside the Apple store, or if you have Google Play, Android, whatever it might be, is going and finding out, do they have a podcast? Because if they do, they likely have guest opportunities. Saying, I love the work you did with your book. This is an amazing opportunity. I feel like my message would have really aligned with your audience and help you continue to sell more books through your podcast. Would you like to talk more? So again, Amazon bestseller list, that works really well for connecting with podcasts that are looking for guests, and you could be a great guest on their podcast. Another one I like to look at is, essentially it's 2 platforms side by side, but YouTube and Facebook groups. Now, Facebook groups, they have an opportunity for you to go in and you give value in advance. You're sharing about the information, saying, okay, if this is a topic that people are talking about, saying, hey, does anybody have a podcast that you would like to talk about this topic a little bit more on? Giving people a chance to raise their hand and say, yes, I'd like to talk about this topic. If it's inside like a Facebook groups thread, it gives people a chance to look at that topic and say, yeah, let's take it from the online as far as like the written thread and let's put it into an actual context of a conversation on a podcast and share that out with their audience. In YouTube, what you're doing is saying, okay, same thing as with Amazon on the bestseller list, finding, okay, super specific niche from a YouTube channel and saying, what you're doing is, I want to look at YouTube as not just a video platform, it is a podcasting platform. I believe YouTube is one of the fastest growing podcast platforms that is still underutilized by quite a bit. We haven't even begun to scratch the surface of the potential of YouTube as a podcasting platform. But what you can do is say, let's have a conversation. Would you like to do just a video interview for your podcast channel about this topic? Now, it may come across like a video interview, but really that's a podcast episode. And what you can do is you can take that audio, you can extract it out through a few different systems like repurpose.io. You can pull out that audio and then you can put bumpers on the front and back of that and save that as a separate file. And that's now a podcast episode. So in some sense, yeah, it's a video interview, but then it becomes a podcast episode at the same time. So YouTube and then Facebook groups. Inside the Facebook groups, let's go back to that for a second. Facebook groups, what you do is you say, okay, if there are topics saying instead of just pitching yourself right off the bat, go in, add your 2 cents, give a meaningful, thoughtful response to a topic or kind of a thread that's going on in a popular Facebook group. And then once you see the conversation going like, hey, I love the fact that we can have this great conversation through a thread standpoint, but could we have a bigger conversation as a podcast interview? Does anybody have a podcast that they would love to talk about this topic that we've been threading about here on the Facebook group? Would you like to talk about this as a podcast interview? So that's another opportunity. Another place I really like looking for podcast guest opportunities is associations and organizations. And associations, like, okay, if you are in your industry, let's say it's in the real estate industry, okay? Go into a real estate association website and find out who are some of the more recent and more popular movers and shakers, and like a Facebook group connected to an association. That's a great place to look as well. And then organizations, where these aren't as formal per se as an association, because they often don't have any type of like association fee attached, but there's still this organization. In fact, some organizations are more involved and more active as a community than some associations, because of the fact that these are more cause-based or heart-based as opposed to a fee-based where many associations tend to be. So you go into an association, you go into an organization, and usually they have a member directory that can be accessible. So you can join that for $25 a month, whatever it might be, and then you can download that list of association members or organization members, and then take that list of names and you start to search in the Apple Podcast Store or inside Google Play and say, okay, if so-and-so is the president of this association, I wonder if they have a podcast. If they have a podcast, are they looking for guest opportunities? And of course, with all of these, you're also looking through, if you do find somebody who has a podcast, look inside their recent podcast episodes. If they don't have guests in their last 10 episodes, they likely don't have guests on their podcast. But that doesn't mean that they're not open to podcast opportunity, to like interview guest opportunities. So you can look at what they're doing with their recent 8, 9, 10 episodes, and again say, here's how I can serve that gap in your audience might be looking for this idea or this topic from this angle, because it's in line with your recent 8, 9, 10 different podcast episodes that you can then say, here's how I can serve your audience and create a great win-win for your podcast. So again, podcast directory is a great place to start. Amazon bestseller lists in an extraordinary different way, different than how people mostly look at podcasts. Then YouTube, turning YouTube into an actual podcast platform. That's an amazing way to have a podcast guest opportunity. But then associations, organizations, those are other great places you can find for looking for great podcast guest opportunities. But you might say, John, I didn't know where to get started. I didn't know how to even introduce myself to different podcast hosts. I don't even know what to say, what my topic is. There are other different recordings that I'm going to include with this that help you figure out how to put together a podcast one sheet, how to put together a podcast speaker bio so you can be able to share it, make it easier for a podcast host to say yes to you, and then also knowing here's how to basically grow your business beyond just the podcast opportunities. And all this information I shared, you might say, I don't even know where to start beyond those. You can go to workwithjohncook.com. You can fill out an application. We'll hop on a call. We'll talk about podcasting. We'll talk about your business, your message, and your market, where you want to go in this next year, and how I can help you align yourself and your business to grow into the future and serve more people, because you have a message that is changing the world, that can change the lives of so many more people if you can just get connected to the right audience. If you like what I shared today, if you love this information, go ahead and hit that like, subscribe button. Make it a great day. We'll catch you next time.